There are days that mark a person's life forever. Not always for what is gained, but for everything one decides never to lose again. Stella Clark was no ordinary woman. For 58 years, she had learned to silence pain, swallow screams, and smile through dinners where she could barely stand her own presence. She was the living portrait of a decorated life, but one full of cracks. Until that Thanksgiving day, at her own table, in the house that had sheltered generations, she understood that a slap could hurt less than a lifetime of humiliation. But this isn't just a story about violence. It's about liberation. About the strength we only discover when everything seems to push us to the bottom. When even your own children turn their backs or worse, raise their hands. In this video, you'll discover the behind-the-scenes of a family conspiracy, riddled with betrayal, financial scandals, family secrets, and a silent revenge prepared with the patience of someone who was tired of losing. And don't be mistaken, every gesture, every word, every look around that table hid more than memories. It hid plans, documents, and truths no one expected to come to light. When Stella smiled, with her face still burning, she was not defeated. She was about to turn the tables. And what came next, well, you'll have to watch until the end to understand why, on that day, it was Oliver who lost everything. For 30 years, Stella had upheld the tradition with steady hands and a calloused heart. Thanksgiving dinner. She handled every detail as if it were her last chance to hold together a family that had long since fractured in silence, manipulation, and unspoken resentments. But no one knew or pretended not to know that behind that abundant table, decorated with dried leaves and grandmother's recipes, there was a woman at her breaking point. What she didn't imagine was that year, the roasted turkey would not be the centerpiece of the night, but rather the slap she would receive from her own son. A slap that came along with the end of the facade. It was supposed to be just another ordinary holiday. Donald, the eldest, called in the morning to confirm his arrival. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But Stella felt a persistent shiver, the kind you learn to ignore when you're used to being betrayed. The table was set, the silverware aligned like obedient soldiers, and the smell of sweet pumpkin mixed with the discomfort growing in her chest. In that house, appearances had always spoken louder than truth. And that year, truth was ravenous. The sound of the door opening brought a wave of tension Stella tried to stifle with a mechanical smile. Oliver arrived first, as if he still believed he had authority there. He carried a leather folder in his hand and an arrogance that had aged poorly. He didn't say hello, didn't ask how she was. He simply handed over the papers coldly, like a waiter serving a sentence. She hadn't even put the dishes on the table yet, and she could already taste the bitterness of humiliation. The document was clear: sale of the lake. The very same lake that held memories of her deceased son, the only summer she had ever truly been happy. Stella realized then that it wasn't just about money. It was about control. About silencing her once and for all. Oliver had always known how to bend those around him. He used affection as currency, manipulation as a tool, and betrayal as a habit. But that signature, on that day, would be the final act of a play she no longer wished to perform. As the hours passed, Donald's presence became suffocating. He repeated his father's gestures and phrases with eerie precision. Stella saw not only a genetic inheritance, but the emotional legacy Oliver had planted in fertile soil. Abigail, the distant daughter, arrived as though visiting a stranger, polite, cold, and clearly disconnected. The table was set, but what lay there was a battlefield on the verge of explosion. And it exploded. At the moment of the toast, Oliver raised his glass with the same pomp as years before, proudly announcing Donald's move to Switzerland. "Well, invest the money from the lake in an international project," he said, as if Stella weren't there. As if she were already dead inside. That was when she asked the question no one expected: and who authorized that sale? The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Then Donald, visibly agitated, stood up, walked to her, and struck her. The slap echoed not only in the room but through the entire history of omissions in that family. Stella fell to her knees, not just from physical pain but from the symbolic weight of a lifetime of being ignored. But something inside her broke her, perhaps, for the first time, came together. When she looked up, her eyes weren't asking for help. They promised an answer. A kind of silent revenge that needed no screams, only strategy. And courage. An unexpected courage. In that moment, something shifted. And not just for Stella. Oliver realized, though too late, that he was no longer in control. Abigail looked at her mother with something that resembled respect. Donald, confused, stepped back. And Stella, with a slow, almost imperceptible smile, stood up. She said nothing. She didn't have to. That was the beginning of the end of Oliver Clark's reign. And the beginning of a late, but devastating liberation. The cruelest betrayal often doesn't come with shouting or arguments. It arrives with a smile, with an "I just want what's best for you," and with hands that pretend to support you while pulling the rug from under your feet. Stella had felt this kind of betrayal her entire life, but it was in that moment between the burning sting of the slap and the silence in the room that she saw things clearly. It wasn't just Oliver. It was the entire system she had sustained. The marriage, the family, the children, all based on a structure where she was useful, but never free. Silent betrayal is the kind you only recognize once the wound is already infected. And Stella had collected those wounds like unsent letters. What hurt the most wasn't the slap itself. It was the fact that no one there seemed surprised. Donald didn't hesitate, Oliver didn't intervene, Abigail didn't cry out. They were all accustomed to the idea that Stella was disposable. A decorative piece in a story they rewrote according to their own interests. But she would never again be a backdrop. It's curious how the human mind tries to justify the unjustifiable. For years, Stella convinced herself that keeping the family together was more important than demanding respect. She accepted Oliver's betrayals as if they were part of the package. As if she had done something to deserve every emotional abandonment, every sly manipulation. But there, on her knees, she understood the mistake wasn't in trusting. It was in continuing to trust once everything had already been revealed. How many times have you ignored the signs? A comment that stings, a gesture that belittles, a decision made without your input. Betrayal doesn't always scream sometimes, it whispers. And it's those whispers that corrode the soul. Stella learned this in the harshest way. And maybe that's the turning point of every great transformation, the moment you realize that if you want to survive, you'll need to betray yourself a little less. You'll need to start choosing yourself. It hurts to accept that the ones you loved most were, in fact, the ones who controlled you the most. That the image of a happy family was, deep down, just a performance. But it's only by facing that pain that a new narrative can be built. And Stella was ready to rewrite her 7 if she still trembled inside. Because there is something stronger than fear, indignation. And on that Thanksgiving Day, she didn't feel fear. She felt fury. A calm, meticulous fury that would change everything. It's important to talk about this. About how women are taught to endure. To accept. To not make a scene. How many Stellas do you know? How many are smiling right now at similar tables, swallowing bitterness served as main course? Silent betrayal is a kind of violence that leaves no visible marks, but destroys from within. And maybe that's what makes it so dangerous. Because it makes the victim doubt herself. But Stella would doubt no more. For the first time, she looked around and didn't see a family but accomplices. And even so, she didn't feel hatred. She felt strategy. In time, she would learn that there is a kind of revenge that doesn't need a scandal, poetic justice. The kind that doesn't raise its voice, but raises evidence. That doesn't confront with screams, but in court. That doesn't destroy, but disarms. And that is where true freedom begins. The most curious part is that even in that moment of humiliation, Stella discovered a spark she had never felt before: power. A power that didn't come from dominating others, but from finally belonging to herself. From knowing that no one else would decide for her. That there would be no more papers signed without her authorization, no more plans drawn in her absence. It was the beginning of a second chance. A late liberation, yes. But above all, a freeing one. Some pains pierce the soul like lightning in a clear sky. That's exactly how Stella felt when Donald, her son, raised his hand against her. The world didn't slow down, it stopped. In that frozen instant in time, all the childhood memories, the lunchbox notes, the birthdays lovingly organized, the cries soothed in her arms, all turned to dust. It was as if that hand had erased decades of motherhood with a single gesture. And what remained was the echo of a betrayal no mother is prepared to face. Donald wasn't just aggressive. He was cold. His eyes fixed, as if in a trance, or as if he had memorized a script. And maybe he had. After all, Oliver's manipulation had created not just an obedient son, but an accomplice. Stella had always known Donald had inherited his father's calculating ways, but seeing it materialized in a slap was devastating. It was more than an act of violence. It was the materialization of a conspiracy. The dinner had turned into a courtroom, and without realizing it, she was the defendant judged by a family that had united against her. It's in moments like this that a person discovers what they're made of. Some crumble, others harden. Stella, surprisingly, found firmness. Not immediately, of course. First came the shock, the dizziness, the disbelief. But soon after, as if something ancient within her awoke, came clarity. The certainty that she was no longer there to apologize for existing. And when she stood, hand on her face and dignity intact, she did something that broke the silence. She smiled. A small smile, but one loaded with meaning. That reaction unsettled everyone. Donald stepped back, unsure if he had done right or wrong. Oliver tried to change the subject, to raise his wine glass again. Abigail, who until then had been distant, looked visibly uncomfortable. They had expected tears, maybe an apology. But what they got was a direct, steady look, devoid of victimhood. Stella would no longer accept humiliation. And the most frightening thing for them, she didn't seem angry, she seemed determined. The physical assault was, paradoxically, the trigger of her liberation. It was as if all the weight Stella had carried, years of control, abandonment, suppressed scandals, family secrets, had turned into fuel. What once chained her now propelled her. Because there is nothing left to fear after being struck by your own son with your ex-husband's approval. That was a turning point. And, as cruel as it sounds, it was also a gift. The bitterest of all, but necessary. This kind of shock reveals the truth about relationships. It exposes what's hidden behind formal dinners and social smiles. It shows who is truly by your side and who was only waiting for the best chance to erase you. And Stella saw clearly there, at that table, she was alone. But not lonely. Alone with her pain, yes. But also with her clarity. And that's what made her dangerous to those who had always underestimated her. It's important to understand that the slap wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what it represented. An entire system validating violence, manipulation, and control. A final attempt to silence the woman they had always tried to make invisible. But the plan backfired. Because in that cowardly gesture, Stella found the strength she needed to act. That was when she stopped surviving and began to fight. Not for acceptance anymore. But for justice. And justice, for someone who had waited so long, wouldn't come quickly. But it would come. Stella knew she wouldn't win that night, nor the following week. But she also knew that slap would be costly. And that every step from then on would be calculated to the millimeter. What they didn't know was that while they celebrated her supposed defeat, she had already begun writing the next chapter. And that chapter would be hers. Hers alone. Sometimes, all you need is a spark. A moment when the world remains the same, but you change inside. For Stella, that moment was crystal clear. She still felt the sting on her face, the fresh humiliation, but something inside her had broken and, paradoxically, been rebuilt. For the first time, she didn't feel fragile. She felt awake. As if all those years of submission had been a long night and at last, the sun had risen. She understood, in that instant, that she would never again be subdued. It was as if a veil had been lifted. Stella, who had always been treated as a supporting role in her own story, realized she must take the lead. And it wasn't a matter of pride or empty revenge. It was about survival. About no longer accepting that her life be decided by others. Oliver could try to control everything, but she had something he never knew how to handle: awareness. And now, with that awareness sharp as a blade, Stella became unpredictable. It's interesting how the mind responds when the soul finally decides not to tolerate abuse anymore. Stella began to mentally revisit every episode of humiliation not as a victim, but as a strategist. Every let it go, every cutting look, every imposed silence, all of it took on new meaning. She no longer blamed herself. She no longer searched for excuses for others' mistakes. The focus now was only one: rebuilding. Hers. The inner shift was so profound it reached her body. Her posture changed. Her voice, once hesitant, came out firm even when she spoke little. She no longer needed to explain herself. The one who was wrong wasn't her. It never was. And it showed. Oliver, so used to manipulating with his eyes and words, began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: insecurity. Because Stella was quiet, yes, but it was the heavy silence of someone who thinks, who calculates, who is preparing. The unexpected courage that blossomed there didn't come out of nowhere. It came from accumulated pain, from abandonment disguised as love, from promises broken one by one. Stella wasn't a weak woman who had finally become strong. She had always been strong, she had just never allowed herself to be. And now that she no longer needed to please anyone or maintain appearances, she could be herself fully. And that was frightening. Terrifying, even. Because a woman aware of her own power is a walking revolution. But she knew wanting justice wasn't enough. Action was needed. Only now, unlike before, she wouldn't beg. She would prove. She wouldn't scream. She wouldn't cry in front of them. She would plan. Because silent revenge is the most efficient. And poetic justice, when backed by evidence, is devastating. Stella didn't want to see Oliver suffer, she wanted to see him face consequences. And that kind of justice isn't asked for. It's built. There, realizing she would no longer be subdued, Stella made a silent decision: she would lose nothing else. Not time, not peace, not pieces of herself. Everything they had tried to take from her: dignity, control, freedom she would reclaim. Slowly, yes. But firmly. And she would start with what they had always tried to erase: her voice. From then on, every word would be a statement. Every choice, a message. And every step, a calculated blow. Stella's turning point had no fireworks. It had silence, introspection, and a latent strength that would become the driving force of everything to come. While they celebrated their false victory around the table, she was already writing in her mind what would be the next act. An act where she would be the author, the protagonist, and the judge. And the first verdict would be simple: never again. Stella Clark was 58 years old, but her soul felt as if it had lived twice that. A resident of Greenfield, a quiet little town in Massachusetts, she was known by all as that polite woman, always greeting with a discreet smile and a kind word. But no one knew the real Stella. The Stella who cried in the bathroom after family gatherings. The Stella who stayed up nights trying to figure out where she had lost herself along the way. She was the image of resilience disguised as routine. Her marriage to Oliver had long been her luxury prison. He was charming to the world, but cruel at home. A strategist, charismatic, but driven by control. He didn't yell, he manipulated. His betrayals never came with apologies, but with cold, rational justifications. And Stella, like so many women of her generation, tried to keep up appearances. After all, what would the neighbors say? What about the children? But inside, she shattered in silence. Oliver was a master manipulator. He could convince anyone of anything, including his own children. Donald, the eldest, followed in his father's footsteps with devotion. He always defended him, even in the face of his worst actions. To him, Stella was fragile, confused, dramatic. He never saw his mother as a strong woman, only as a convenient figure. Abigail, the middle child, was distant. Polite, but emotionally disconnected. She preferred not to get involved. And Blake, the youngest Blake, was different. He was the only one who truly saw Stella. But he was gone too soon. Blake's death was the hardest blow of Stella's life. A car accident on a rainy night took away the only child who saw her for who she truly was. He was sensitive, he listened, he questioned his father. And that, of course, caused tension at home. The pain of his absence was never overcome, only silenced like everything else in that family. Stella never fully cried for Blake. She had to keep functioning, had to keep being strong. But now, looking back, she understood his death had also been the end of the last emotional anchor that tied her to that family. Greenfield was the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, but no one knows the truth. And that worked in Oliver's favor. He was respected, praised, seen as a pillar of the community. No one imagined that, behind appearances, there was a man who humiliated his wife with subtle phrases, unilateral decisions, and a silence that screamed. Stella, on the other hand, was invisible to the town's eyes. She was Oliver's wife. Never Stella, the woman. And that slowly ate her away inside. Even so, she wasn't weak. On the contrary. Stella was a woman who endured far more than she should have, but who never stopped observing, noting, remembering. For years, she accumulated not only pain but also information. Papers, records, careless confessions. Everything that seemed irrelevant, she kept. And it was this quiet skill of observation that would save her later. Because while everyone underestimated her intelligence, she was assembling the puzzle. Stella hadn't had close friends for a long time. Oliver made sure to isolate anyone who tried to form bonds with her. He said it was for the good of the family. And she, in an effort to keep the peace, accepted it. But there was one exception: Harriet Winters, her lawyer and longtime ally. Harriet had always known Stella was stronger than she looked. And it was thanks to her that Stella began to understand she could take control of her life, her assets, her freedom. It was the beginning of the shift. Understanding Stella's context is essential to grasp the magnitude of her transformation. She wasn't just a betrayed or humiliated woman. She was someone who had spent her entire life building the stage where others shone until she decided to tear it down and build a new one. One where she would no longer be a supporting role, but the protagonist. And that decision, however late, changed everything. For 30 years, Stella had been the invisible architect of family holidays. Thanksgiving, in particular, was her most symbolic ritual. She insisted on keeping every detail as it had always been: the hand-embroidered tablecloth, her grandmother's china, the dishes that told a story: garlic mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie, turkey stuffed with walnut dressing. Even tired, even wounded, she cooked as if resisting. As if keeping tradition were her last way to preserve order in a world that had long collapsed. That morning, however, something was different. Stella wasn't just preparing a dinner. She was preparing herself. Her mind was restless. The air in the house felt heavier. There was a premonition in the atmosphere as if something were about to happen. And she knew. She knew that dinner wouldn't be like the others. It was as if every polished fork and every table arrangement were pieces on a larger chessboard, where appearances hid intentions. Her intuition screamed, but she kept going. Calmly. Methodically. In the middle of the preparations, the phone rang. It was Donald. He announced that his father would arrive with some papers for Stella to sign. The phrase was dry, direct, leaving no room for questions. "Sign what?" she asked. "Just something simple, we'll explain later," he replied, and hung up. Stella held the phone for a few seconds, staring at the void as if reading a declaration of war. That wasn't just a warning. It was a move. And she understood something bigger was coming. Behind that request to sign papers was a hidden story, a silent conspiracy revolving around an asset far more valuable than they imagined. Stella knew: the lake. That piece of land and water, the backdrop of so many happy summers with Blake, wasn't just a pretty place. It was emotional and financial heritage. And Oliver knew it. He knew it so well that he was willing to do anything to take it from her. What he didn't know was that Stella also knew. And she had already prepared. As she peeled potatoes and stirred the cranberry sauce, Stella replayed the past few years in her mind. Small slips of conversation, meetings that seemed innocent, questions disguised as curiosity. Everyone was involved. Donald, with his executive demeanor, Abigail, distant but convenient, and Oliver, of course, the conductor of manipulation. And now they were ready for the final blow disguised as a family toast. Stella knew that dinner was a trap. But it would also become a trap for them. She took deep breaths and kept preparing everything. To an outside observer, she looked serene. No one would ever imagine that behind that calm exterior, a sharp mind was fully alert. Every folded napkin, every lit candle, was preparation for war. She wasn't trying to please anymore. She was there to observe. To confirm suspicions. To hear what was never said aloud. And, above all, to strike back not with screams, but with actions. Thanksgiving had always carried a strange symbolism for Stella. It was the day she faked the most. When she smiled the hardest to hide the pain. But that year, she decided no more pretending. She wouldn't smile out of politeness. She wouldn't keep silent out of convenience. She was tired of serving the feast while they served conspiracy. Tired of feeding those who tried to empty her. And that exhaustion turned into focus. Clarity. Planning. It was her chance to turn the tables. That late afternoon, as the golden light streamed through the kitchen windows, Stella took one last look at the table. Everything was perfect. Just as it had always been. But for the first time, she didn't feel trapped by that perfection. She felt free inside her own home. Free and ready. Because deep down, she knew what was coming wouldn't be pretty. But it would be necessary. And perhaps, it would be the beginning of the justice she so deeply deserved. When Oliver walked into Stella's house that evening, he didn't knock like a guest. He entered as he always had, like someone who still believed he owned everything. Even after the divorce, he carried himself like the untouchable patriarch, as if time hadn't eroded his authority. Impeccable suit, the scent of expensive cologne, and a cold stare that ignored the tense atmosphere of the house. In his hand, a black folder, and inside it, the blow. "Stella, we need to sign these papers before dinner," he said, without looking her in the eye. It was always like that. Short phrases, spoken with superiority. He treated everything as if it were just a formality, a minor obligation. But Stella was no longer the woman she once was. She didn't take the folder. She folded her arms. "Papers for what?" she asked, already knowing the answer. And that's when Oliver revealed his trump card. Or rather, what he thought was a trump card: the sale of the lake. "We found a buyer," he said. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You just need to sign and rest easy." Donald took care of everything. The attempt to use their son's name as a token of trust was almost cynical. Stella felt her blood run cold, but she didn't show it. The lake was hers. And Oliver knew it. He knew that years ago, she had registered it in her name with Harriet's discreet help. He was betting she didn't remember, that she was confused, manipulable. He was betting on the old Stella. But the old Stella had died with Donald's slap. What stood before him now was a woman rebuilding herself. She picked up the papers calmly, flipping through them as if reading poetry. When she reached the amount, a 7-digit number, she understood the magnitude of the conspiracy. They weren't just trying to sell a property. They were trying to erase her from her own story. To eliminate every trace of autonomy. To reduce her existence to a signature. "Have you told Abigail?" she asked, still turning the pages. "Of course." "Everyone agreed," Oliver replied. "Everyone." The word echoed. Stella understood that dinner was a celebration of exclusion. They had already decided everything. They already knew how to spend the money. They already had plans for Switzerland, investments, trips. Everything. And her? She was supposed to be the old generous lady who signed without understanding. But what they didn't know was that Stella understood perfectly. And she was far from generous at that moment. The encounter reignited every painful memory of Stella's marriage. The repeated betrayals, the sleepless nights waiting, the manipulations disguised as care. Oliver had always been a master at reversing roles. He was the hero, she the ungrateful one. He the provider, she the burden. But now, in that moment, she no longer saw a powerful man. She saw a desperate man. A man who, for the first time, felt he might lose control. Stella closed the folder gently and handed it back. "We'll talk after dinner," she said. Oliver frowned, surprised at the firmness in her tone. It wasn't a request, it was an order disguised as politeness. And for the first time, he backed down. Because he felt it. He felt something was off script. And it unsettled him. Stella was different. Calmer, sharper, more dangerous. He simply nodded and left the kitchen. Alone again, Stella sat at the table and took a deep breath. She had just faced the man who had subdued her for decades. And she hadn't trembled. She hadn't cried. And most importantly, she hadn't signed. That was the first of many battles. But it was also the first victory. She knew the greater confrontation was yet to come. But in that moment, Stella was ready. And Oliver was not. When the clock struck 7, Stella's house was glowing, filled with the smell of spices and the most deafening silence in the family's history. The table, beautifully set, gave no hint of the tension in the air. Abigail was the first to surprise. She arrived unannounced, holding a bouquet of flowers and a nervous smile. Stella hadn't seen her in almost 2 years. The hug was lukewarm, and her daughter's eyes avoided hers. That visit wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed. And that only confirmed what Stella already knew. They were all there for one reason. Abigail's presence was symbolic. For years, she had remained distant both emotionally and geographically. Always indifferent to the dramas of the house. But that night, she was there. Dressed to impress, perfectly made up, chatting about trivialities as if she were at a party. It was all an act. And Stella, with her new clarity, saw every gesture as part of a theater play. This wasn't a family dinner. It was an ambush. And she was right at the center of it. Oliver's toast was the peak of cynicism. He raised his glass, as in other years, but with an enthusiasm that bordered on sarcasm. To family. To a new chapter. To the opportunities that come with brave decisions, he said, with an air of leadership. And then, as if launching a missile disguised as a gift, he announced, "Our son Donald is moving to Switzerland. A new project, a wonderful investment, the result of an important deal we all support." Everyone. Once again, the word that excluded Stella. Abigail's look couldn't hide her discomfort. Did she not know about the sale? Or was she pretending? Donald, on the other hand, smiled with satisfaction. As if he were receiving a prize. Stella remained silent, watching. It was like attending a play written by others, where they expected her to applaud at the end. But she wouldn't. She was there as both spectator and judge. And in her silence, she plotted. With every sip of wine, every bite, she was rewriting the script of that night. Then she asked, her voice serene, "And how do you plan to divide the profits from the sale?" The table froze. Oliver cleared his throat. Donald tried to smile. Abigail looked away. No one expected that question. She had ruined the script. "Well, Mom, you know, the money will be used for everyone's good," Donald said hesitantly. "Ah, of course. For everyone's good. Which apparently doesn't include me," Stella replied, still smiling. Her tone was calm, but the message was a bomb. From that moment on, the veneer of civility began to crack. Oliver tried to intervene, saying, "It's better to talk about this another time," but Stella insisted. "The time is now. After all, we're all here. The family is together." She saw them restless, unsettled. And that gave her strength. Because finally, truth was on the table and not just the turkey. They had planned everything: the sale, the investment in Europe, her exclusion. But they forgot one important detail: Stella was no longer the same. Donald's reaction when he realized his mother wasn't willing to cooperate was revealing. Impatience consumed him. He tried to appear rational, but arrogance dripped from every word. Abigail stayed quiet, clearly uncomfortable, but too afraid to take a stand. And Oliver, for the first time, couldn't control the narrative. Stella had turned the tables with nothing but questions. And that disarmed them. They expected emotional resistance. Instead, they got logic. Strategically calculated. Dinner ended without dessert. No one had the stomach for pumpkin pie. Stella, however, was satisfied. Not because of the food, but because of the effect she had caused. They knew now that she knew. And that she wouldn't give in. The heavy atmosphere was a prelude to the confrontation to come. But at that moment, Stella was no longer afraid. For the first time in decades, she felt in control not of the family, but of herself. And that alone was already a revolution. What began with veiled words quickly escalated into unbearable tension. When Stella decided to face Oliver directly about the sale of the lake, the dining room turned into a minefield. You always liked deciding everything alone, Oliver. But this time, you forgot one detail: the lake is mine. The sentence was spoken firmly, without raising her voice. But it was enough to throw her ex-husband off balance. His authority, built on years of manipulation, began to crumble. He tried to counter, but Stella no longer backed down. There was no more room for control. Donald, watching his mother confront his father with such certainty, was consumed by a mix of confusion and rage. He had always seen Stella as fragile, easy to bend. This new posture unsettled him. He tried to interrupt Mom. "This isn't the time for drama." Stella looked straight at him. "You hit me, Donald. That's not drama. That's a crime." The sentence fell like a bucket of cold water on the table. Abigail looked away. Oliver pretended not to hear. But Donald felt it. He felt it because he had never imagined his mother would have the courage to expose, to name, what had always been swept under the rug. That's when he snapped. He rose from his chair with brutality, pointing his finger at Stella as if he still held power over her. "You're going to ruin everything out of pride? Out of spite?" The tension thickened into smoke. Stella, still seated, remained calm. "No, I'm going to protect what's mine. You don't know what that is, do you, Donald? Because you've never had to build anything with your own hands." Her response disarmed him. But he wasn't ready to lose. He had been conditioned to win. And that's why he lunged again. The second slap wasn't a surprise, but it was the last attempt. When he raised his hand, Stella didn't move. Not out of fear, but because she wanted everyone to see. She wanted it to be clear. This time, the gesture was stopped by Abigail. For the first time, she stood up and grabbed her brother's arm. "Are you out of your mind?" she said, shocked. Donald backed off, and silence settled like a heavy veil. Stella calmly rose. And then she did the unthinkable. She smiled. It wasn't a smile of relief, nor of irony. It was a smile of liberation. Like someone who finally understands she never has to be afraid again. "Thank you," she said, looking into each of their eyes. "You've just given me exactly what I needed." Oliver tried to compose himself, but his expression betrayed him. He had lost control. Donald sat back down, his hands trembling now. Abigail, still standing, looked visibly shaken. And Stella was a storm in disguise. From that moment on, the dynamic changed. Stella no longer needed to argue. She had already won. Because when someone is struck and still remains standing without screaming, without despair, that person shifts the balance of power. She was no longer a victim. She was the new leader of the narrative. And the most powerful man at that table was now the most exposed. Oliver knew it. And that knowledge hurt more than any accusation. There was no more conversation that night. Stella climbed the stairs slowly, like an actress leaving the stage after the final act. But she knew the show was just beginning. The violence had left its marks, yes, but it had also revealed who those people truly were. And with that truth laid bare, she had everything she needed to act. Because justice, for her, wasn't a scream. It was construction. And what would come next would be meticulous, relentless, and legally devastating. And so, with her dignity intact and her pain transformed into strategy, Stella set her plan in motion. A plan that didn't involve revenge out of emotion, But poetic justice out of reason. The family thought she had lost control. Little did they know she had never been more in command. The next morning, Stella woke before sunrise. She knew this wasn't an ordinary day. It was the day when truth would stop being a shadow and become a weapon. She dressed with sobriety, tied up her hair, and with the same blue folder she had once kept hidden, she went downstairs. The house still smelled of the previous night's feast, but now, she was the one directing the next steps. When everyone gathered in the living room, summoned by a simple "we need to talk," Stella was already seated at the head of the table, a cup of tea before her. "What is it now?" Donald muttered impatiently. Stella opened the folder with the calm of someone who knew exactly where she stood. "Let's get straight to the point. This is the deed to the lake. It's in my name. And it's been registered for more than 15 years. She placed the document on the table with surgical precision. The silence was brutal. Oliver tried to disguise his surprise, but the pallor on his face betrayed him. Donald grabbed the paper, read it, and resisted believing it. "This is you should have told us. And you should have respected me," Stella replied, without raising her voice, but the real blow was yet to come. She pulled out a second set of documents, bank statements, suspicious transfers, illegal transactions. "These are your accounts, Oliver. All of them. Including the offshore ones you used to hide the sale of shares under other names." With every page Stella placed on the table, Oliver's world crumbled a little more. Abigail, until then silent, picked up one of the papers with trembling hands. "Is this true?" she asked, almost whispering. Oliver didn't answer. Donald looked away. The castle of lies was collapsing without explosions. It was collapsing under the weight of truth. Stella remained serene, as if she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. And then came the video. A recorded testimony with Harriet, her lawyer, where Stella recounted years of abuse, manipulations, and betrayals with dates, names, facts. "If anything happens to me, this video goes to the press. And to the district attorney's office. The threat was real, but it wasn't theatrical. It was a shield. And Oliver knew it. For the first time, he was cornered. Not by fury, but by evidence. With the documentation in hand, Harriet initiated a series of legal measures. The Clark Family Trust was reinforced with additional clauses, protecting Stella from any attempt at contestation. At the same time, a formal lawsuit was filed for fraud and breach of trust against Oliver with all the documents attached. But the counterattack took on a new shape when Stella discovered what they had been planning behind her back. Amber, Zach's girlfriend, Stella's grandson's partner, appeared with wide eyes and a timid courage. "Stella, they want to have you declared incompetent." The young woman revealed a recording made by accident. Her destiny, where Oliver and Donald openly discussed their plan to declare Stella mentally unfit, manipulating doctors and presenting old documents to annul her legal decisions. The recording was clear, shocking, cruel. "She's unstable. A little confused. That's enough to request guardianship," Oliver's voice said on the recording, as if discussing a business deal. Stella didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply looked at Amber and said, "Thank you. That's what was missing." With Harriet's help, she filed a lawsuit for fraudulent guardianship attempt and falsification of documents. And she attached the audio to the main evidence. At the same time, Stella began to take up space in the community like never before. She wrote columns for the local newspaper, attended social events, and showed herself to be lucid, active, respected. Zach, moved by his grandmother's courage, publicly took her side, symbolically breaking the chain of silence that had bound previous generations. The stage was set while Oliver prepared to erase her. She was becoming impossible to ignore. The silence that fell over Oliver Clark's house after the court summons was not an ordinary silence. It was the sound of an entire structure collapsing. The papers arrived stamped and airtight. A case opened for financial fraud, malicious guardianship attempt, asset concealment, and financial abuse. The man who had manipulated everyone around him for decades was now called to answer for every one of his choices, not at elegant dinners, but in court. Oliver tried to reach out to powerful lawyers, but the audio revealed by Amber, combined with the documents and Stella's recorded testimony, made any defense fragile, almost pathetic. The downfall was swift. The corporate board he had been part of for over 20 years suspended him indefinitely. His partners washed their hands of him. Companies he had deals with began cutting ties quietly. The image of the respected community leader crumbled before public opinion. Oliver was no longer seen as a leader, but as a cruel manipulator who had tried to turn his ex-wife into a clinical case just to steal her assets. And this narrative, now exposed, echoed loudly among neighbors, former friends, former employees, and even former business partners. Donald fell apart. Seeing his father exposed that way, and, above all, realizing he had become a puppet in his scheme. He couldn't bear the weight of his own silence. He tried to confront Oliver, but was ignored. And in that abandonment, he understood what Stella had endured for so many years. Broken, he withdrew from social circles and sought therapy. Abigail, in turn, fled public exposure. She claimed she had been deceived, but convinced no one. The messages Stella had saved showed clearly that she knew about the guardianship planned, and for that, she too would be held accountable. While the family crumbled, Stella bloomed. At the lake that once symbolized her emotional prison, she now rose as a symbol of freedom. The place came back to life. The office Oliver had once used became a reading room with a view of the water. She didn't want to erase the past, she wanted to rewrite it. Every corner of the house became a declaration: I am alive, I am whole, I am in control. Zach and Amber began to visit often. They were no longer just grandson and girlfriend, they were her new family. Stella wasn't seeking personal revenge. Her justice was deeper, the poetic justice of seeing truth prevail, of reclaiming her identity, of having a voice. She began writing articles about women's autonomy and legal rights in the local paper, something she had never imagined doing. She joined women's circles in the community, many of whom were moved to tears when they heard her story. For the first time, she spoke and was heard. For the first time, her pain made sense. It had transformed into strength. But the most symbolic moment came weeks later, when she was invited to give a talk on liberation and new beginnings at a library in Greenfield. Stella walked on stage dressed in simplicity and power. She spoke with clarity, without embellishment, without self-pity. She told how she had been erased from her own life and how she rebuilt her narrative with patience, courage, and evidence. At the end, she received a standing ovation. Among the audience, women of all ages rose with tears in their eyes. It was more than a speech, it was a collective rite of passage. After that night, Stella returned to the lake and walked to the shore where Blake used to sit. There, she found one of his old notebooks, forgotten in a box. Inside, a note written in his crooked teenage handwriting: Mom, you are the strongest person I know. When you realize that, no one will ever be able to stop you. She smiled, feeling the wind on her face, as if her son were still there. In that moment, she understood her fight had never been only about herself. It was about all the women who came before her. And all those who would come after. And that's how Stella Clark, at 58 years old, stopped being the quiet woman in the elegant house and became the lady of her own destiny, without ever needing to raise her voice. Without dirtying her hands. Only with truth, evidence, courage, and time. The woman they tried to silence with a slap responded with the only thing they never knew how to anticipate: structured dignity. And while Oliver faced the courts and the weight of isolation, she finally discovered what freedom truly means. Some stories don't end. They remain. They cling to memory, not because of the tears, but because of the transformation they provoke. Stella Clark's story is not about a slap, it's about everything that came before it. It's about decades of silent betrayal, manipulation disguised as affection, abandonment masked as tradition. It's about a woman who was pushed into the footnotes of her own existence and who, even so, didn't just survive, she rewrote the entire title. How many women live years erasing themselves to keep alive a household where they are never truly seen? How many carry the weight of holding entire families together while their own inner structure crumbles? Stella could have been just another one of those stories, but she chose something else. She chose to step out of the role of victim and into the role that had always been hers, that of the author. And that changes everything. Because when a woman wakes up, the system that once subdued her begins to collapse. The most powerful part of this journey wasn't the scandal, nor the lawsuits. It was the look. Stella's look when she said no for the first time, without raising her voice. The steady look when she revealed she had proof. The contained smile when she realized she no longer needed anyone's approval. That's the kind of strength so many underestimate, the strength of a woman who doesn't want revenge, but truth. Who doesn't seek payback, but justice. Who doesn't want to shout louder, but to finally be heard. And if this story is stirring something inside you, then I have an invitation. Don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their worth. Someone who has been silent for far too long. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because here, we tell the stories the world tries to hide. Stories that aren't just entertainment. They're mirrors. They're warnings. They're beacons. The most poetic thing of all is that Stella didn't become someone new. She simply returned to being who she had always been, before they tried to erase her light. And that is the great message. Your freedom may take time, it may hurt, it may come with scars. But when it comes, it heals. And when it heals, it transforms. And when it transforms, It breaks cycles and leaves a legacy. Perhaps Stella's greatest revenge was exactly this: to keep going. With grace. With strategy. With soul. The world tried to silence her with control and violence. She answered with courage and dignity. And today, her story remains here, etched into the memory of everyone who listened until the very end. Because when justice is poetic, it doesn't need fireworks. Only time. And Stella, at last, has all the time in the world.